something like 27 million people in Britain consider themselves gardeners. If you can harness those people, if you can get them thinking about their relationship with the natural world, with wildlife, with invertebrates, with bugs, with biodiversity, you're getting quite a big chunk of Britain heading in the right direction.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World, and I'm here with author and teacher and new friend, James Canton. James, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Very welcome. Lovely to be here, Ben.
So, James, what I really wanted to talk to you about in this conversation is your most recent book, Renaturing. I'm fascinated by this idea of our ability to restore nature, even on very small plots of land, even a window box. And I was co-chair of the Rewilding London Task Force, and that was really what it was about. How can we create streaks and patches of wild nature through the fabric of the City of London. But before we get there, I'd like to talk about kind of some of the earlier work you've done and kind of the central theme of your career. Now, I've got a copy of Ancient Wanderings, Travels in Prehistoric Britain. And you more recently published a book called Grounded, A Journey into the Landscapes of Our Ancestors. And I'm just fascinated by this idea of the intense connection that people in this country, Britain, had through the ages with landscape, with nature, on a kind of spiritual level. And perhaps for a period at least, those bonds have been reduced or severed. And maybe now we're entering into an era where we're rediscovering the importance of nature to our individual and collective well-being. And I just wanted to read you, I took this off the wall last night from my bathroom. It's the funeral brochure, if that's what you call it, for my late Uncle Teddy, who I love very much. I lost my father at 15, and my Uncle Teddy stepped in and was kind of a father figure to Zach, and my brother and me. And we published a quote on the book that we handed out at his funeral. And this was what he said: "The ecology we need is not the ecology that involves viewing the ecosphere on which we depend for our survival at a distance and with scientific detachment. We will not save our planet by means of a conscious, rational and unemotional decision, a sort of ecological contract based on a cost-benefit analysis. A moral and emotional commitment is required. Indeed, one of the key tasks of ecology must be to redirect our emotions so that they may fulfill the role they were designed for, to commit us to what should be the overriding human enterprise of maintaining the critical order of the ecosphere." So he used to write lengthy books and everything. But I know this in my belly that cost-benefit analysis is a big part of it, but we've got to reconnect in a cultural, emotional or spiritual way with nature. So this, I think, is the most interesting theme of your work. It's been really the work of your life.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful quote, Ben. I mean, that really is. But absolutely. I mean, in essence, it's about that intimacy as humans on a landscape with the natural world, that kind of central core thing that, we are of nature. We're not separate from nature. Nature isn't outside that window. It's with us all the time. We are nature. And I think, we can kind of say it in a kind of intellectual, academic way, but it has to be kind of physical. It has to be kind of earthy. It's nothing new. We just need to remember it. We need to remind ourselves as humans of that intimacy, that intimate connection with the earth, with the natural world. And that's all it's about.
So imagine you could step back, 3,000 years, 4,000 years into Neolithic Essex. I presume you're sitting in Essex right now, James.
I am, yeah.
Yeah, so day to day in the lives of those people, our ancestors that lived there, what was the nature of their connection with nature, beyond the obvious, beyond the total and utter dependence, which we may have masked somewhat with the modern comforts that we enjoy, but we obviously still depend. I love these quotes you sometimes get saying, economists reckon that 50% of global GDP is dependent upon nature. I don't know how they come up with 50%, surely it's 100%. But back then they were close to it, minute to minute. So, but in a spiritual sense, how would that have manifested?
I think even trying to break down the kind of the layerings at which that takes place. If you go back far enough, if I can budge you back a little bit further to kind of hunter-gathering, gardening humans, pre-farming, then we are 100%, we are out there all the time. We are just entirely reliant on our knowledge of the natural world. And that's everything from augury, like knowing about bird patterns and bird movements and what that means seasonally, what that means is taking place in a wider scale beyond our horizons. And that carries right the way through. People talk about this divide between farming and pre-farming and farming. There is a lot of crossover in terms of the way that humans are operating within the landscape. Yes, okay, some kind of core things have changed. But I think as humans, it takes quite a long period of time before we've really moved over and we're, if you like, colonizing the land, if you want to talk about it like that. And even then, in Neolithic times, we're very much embedded in our local landscapes. I think that for me, that's one of the core things that takes place as we move to farming, is local becomes really much more important. Whereas when we're still hunter-gatherers, there's much more sort of seasonality. There's that requirement of, groups of people going off and collecting flints. There's groups of people that are going off and, collecting salmon, if I can put it like that, and others at other times, you might have like deer migrations through the landscape, so it's all about this sense of humans recognizing themselves as another species within the natural world.
And if you look at some of the iconography of, say, the early Middle Ages, you see that depiction of nature and existence as an infinitely complex clock, those kind of clock drawings, and I think this recognition that nature is intricate beyond our ability to understand and mysterious. I'm drawn to those images, but I'm also drawn to the idea of nature as a kind of mirror that reflects some reality beyond a veil of some sort. A book that had a big impact on me was the then Prince of Wales, King Charles's book, Harmony, which was published, I guess, 15 or 18 years ago. And I remember reading that and the idea that there was a break from nature at around the time of the Enlightenment, kind of Descartes and the kind of Enlightenment philosophers who said, no, nature is a machine. But biological organisms are just machines. I think Descartes, did he not dissect his dog alive to demonstrate to the audience that this is not just great. A machine? Yeah. And therefore, we can kind of raid the larder as we choose without any worry about empathy or unkindness or any kind of moral or emotional connection with nature, because it's just a machine. And anything mystical, God, ghosts, they are elsewhere. They're kind of invisible in some other place. And this kind of separation occurred, which I think now King Charles identifies in his book as the root cause of our behavior today, destroying nature. But if you look at early Christianity, it was all one. This kind of invisible reality and a visible reality were indistinguishable from each other.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's a really nice point, because if you look at the religion, if you like, of the people that we were talking about, sort of from the Neolithic and earlier, the common term is shamanism, but it's this interwoven connectedness, the kind of this myriad of living that is the earth, if you like, and again, humans, we're part of that, and our connection with particular animals is intimate, is at certain times in particular kind of shamanic practices is almost more than intimate. It's a kind of it's a this kind of fusion of existence. So again, as you say, like as you move through, it's sort of 200, 300, 400 years ago, we start to see this divide, particularly within Western Europe, of course, and of course, a lot of people within the world. Indigenous belief systems, they still maintain this different way, this way of not seeing a separation, but seeing a connection.
And the practice of using psychedelic brews of various sorts was ubiquitous in those shamanistic societies. But I think we know this in our gut, right? I mean, I in my life I had a disaster, which was I lost my daughter Iris, age 15, here on our farm in Canwood, and the unimaginable darkness that engulfs you when you lose a child. And I knew from the earliest moments that there was solace to be found in nature. Now we have a pond that I swim in, and I would go down to that pond and I would swim 5-8 times a day, just because being in the water and then popping up into the sunlight and seeing the kind of this sort of benevolent indifference, this kind of, the little dragonflies scooting around above the water and the butterflies and the trees blowing above my head. And I just felt held in a way that nothing else did. And so we know it, that there's something there beyond what perhaps science can articulate in terms of a need, a yearning. And I think that now that we're going through a period, a kind of cultural moment, not just in Britain, but in the world, of rediscovering that yearning. I mean, how many friends do we have that have a mindfulness app? And I'm involved with the launch of a new app called Wildling, which is about connecting with nature and in your local area. And it's hugely in demand, all of this. So I think your book is really well timed. The most recent one, which is Renaturing, which is about restoring nature today in the landscapes that we've inherited, in which we have become very disconnected with nature. And I've noticed that with smaller spaces, we're often quite crap at making provision for wildlife. You know, when you think of kind of the landscape design industry or the horticultural industry, you know, it's often about buying exotic, fancy plants from the garden centre, nothing native, which, you know, these exotic plants which provide nothing for invertebrates or for birds. It's often about tidiness and sweeping up and creating hard spaces of concrete and decking and so on. So what is the answer, James, for the average person, you know, who's lucky enough to have influence over even a very small patch of land? How do we restore natural abundance to our lives in that way?
Yeah. I mean, I heard the stat the other day, something like 27 million people in Britain consider themselves gardeners. If you can harness those people, and as you say, in all kinds of ways, if you can get them thinking about their relationship with the natural world, with wildlife, with invertebrates, with bugs, with biodiversity, you're getting quite a big chunk of Britain heading in the right direction, if you like. So yeah, my book, Renaturing, really was about that idea of small-scale nature restoration. Everything from what I called my mini meadow, a kind of tiny little window box that I've kind of created, right the way up, as far as I'm concerned, to say 1,000 acres, because I don't, you know, one of the journeys that I went on in the book, in writing the book, was discovering, you know, what rewilding really is. You know, we have so many ways. I think if you did a survey and you asked people on the streets what rewilding was, you get a kind of myriad. There'd be a kind of generality. It was about bringing nature back. But, you know, you have adverts now that talk about kind of rewilding your hair, you know, using particular shampoos that will kind of make you feel more natural again. You know, it's like,
I love Natalie Fee and her band's song, which was called Bring Back the Beaver, which is a kind of, you know, a brilliant kind of women's lib and rewilding song because of the double entendre, which made me laugh a lot.
Exactly. You know, and, you know, in a way, like don't get me in any way wrong, I want to keep the word rewilding, but we need more words. We need more language with this because, you know, otherwise it just becomes very, very simple relationship with nature, doesn't it? You know, so and one of the things that I think was key for me is I come from London. You know, I'm a kind of urban kid at heart, if you like. And I was very fortunate about 25 years ago. I moved to the countryside and I moved to a very small village in rural North Essex. And that was kind of the journey, well, the starting point really of the journey of the book, Renaturing.
So I want to just read you a stat that I found this morning by chance relating to North America. So Americans spend more than $36 billion every year on lawn care, which is 4.5 times more than the entire government budget for environmental protection. I mean, it's just staggering. And if half of American lawns were replaced with native plants, Americans would create the equivalent of a 20 million acre national park, which is 9 times bigger than Yellowstone. I mean, the numbers are just staggering. And so it's not all necessarily about agriculture. It's about tidiness and it's about a need for control and order in the landscape that has simply expunged wildlife and nature from our lives. And I think that is the biggest cultural challenge we've got in reconnecting people with nature, is embracing self-willed natural processes and understanding that mess is beauty, you know, and that we've misconstrued what mess is.
Mess is so important, but I think as well, if I can add in, I think there's an urban context to this. You know, I think my journey of coming from London, from a kind of urban centre, and in a way an urban mindset. You know, I'd lived around the world. I lived in Cairo, lived in big cities around the world, and I suddenly realised that I'd never lived in the countryside. So when I moved to the countryside 25 years ago, went to visit a small, you know, went to have a little viewing of a small farm labourer's cottage that myself and my partner wanted to buy. Around the back, over a green lane, which was very enticing, there was a sign that said for sale on a field. And this, you know, I was like, what? A field? I'm not meant to buy a field. I come from London. We don't buy fields. That's farmers. Farmers have fields. And it was a small, 2 acre plot, you know, X bit of farmland. And that really sold it for me. So we bought the cottage, we bought the field. moved in, and then I was very much, by the time we moved in, it was May. I'd seen it in February. All the grass, funnily enough, had grown up to about my waist. And my partner said, what are you going to do with this field then? And I was, I was like, well, good question. And all I could really think of was to have a cricket match, to have a yearly cricket match, get all my mates from London up. We'd have a cricket match in the field. We could all camp in the field, have a nice party. And so that's what I did. So again, as you say, it almost like the idea of tidying up, of kind of creating flat, kind of dead, green concrete spaces, if you like. It was still within my head. That's what I thought I'd do.
So I can't tell you the number of people among my kind of wider friends and colleagues and beyond who mentioned to me, we've got a couple of acres, we live in the country, we've got a big garden, or, we've got this field, but we don't really know what to do with it. And of course, we can't really do rewilding. We don't have enough space for that. And people don't know what to do. And so the normal thing is, well, I'll just let the neighbour run their sheep there. Or I'll get a ride-on lawnmower. My friends who I visited in Bruton yesterday for tea, they've got a ride-on lawnmower, and he absolutely loves zipping up and down and making sure it's all tidy. And it's a big piece of land. He's got, maybe 2 acres, which could be absolutely full of wildlife. I said he should put some trackers on his children and see where they're running around on the lawn and commit only to mowing the spaces that they're using, to play their football or whatever, and leave all the rest. If it's not walked on except for when it's mowed, then it ought not to be mowed.
That's a really good steer.
But there's a brilliant guy who lives near me who's been on this podcast called Jonathan Thompson.
Oh,
and
yeah.
And with his wife, Keggy Carew, who's an author, they sold up in London and they bought 22 acres near Tisbury. And he has pioneered rewilding small spaces. He's figured out how you recreate natural processes on a space anywhere from 1/4 of an acre to 30 or 40 acres, spaces that are too small to have a herd of cows or some pigs. And in effect, you have to be the keystone species. He will get volunteers in and they will be bison with chainsaws or hacksaws for a day, or they will be beavers and they'll create analog beaver dams along the stream, or they'll be wild boar and they'll create disturbance in the earth. And it's a different kind of woodland gardening, and it's much more hands-on than larger scale rewilding approaches. And the results are just miraculous. You go there and the right time of year, you can feel the birdsong pulsating in your bones, and just the joy this has brought Jonathan Thompson. And his message is, if you can afford it, if you've got savings, or if you've got a house that you're willing to kind of trade and move out and get some land somewhere else, and a cottage somewhere, get yourself a bit of land in one way or another. And if you can't, then volunteer with a local wildlife organisation. I'm sitting right now half a mile from Heel, Somerset. They're rewilding 460 acres, and they're absolutely teeming with volunteers and students and forest school and kids and everything. Not huge numbers of people are participating in this unbelievable reawakening of nature on a former dairy farm. So I think this is the route to, like, one of the most important routes to well-being and happiness.
Yeah, and without a doubt, we've got the stats to prove it as well. If you need statistical evidence. But I mean, everything that you said, absolutely. I think I've rather sort of stumbled through this process over the last 25 years. So my story, the story that I tell in Renaturing is this movement away from the cricket pitch, if you like, the sit-on mower every 2 weeks, cutting down the best part of 2 acres. And essentially about 15 years ago, starting the process of moving to what I called rewilding at the time, and which was essentially just leaving the edges, and it's most of the time it's just letting nature do its thing. So letting the jays plant the acorns and letting them turn into oak trees that became what are now what I call the young oaks, and they took over the edges of this field. And we still continued for a little while having this cricket match. The pitch became worse and worse, and then I just said, right, this is it. About 10 years ago, it's like no more, and started to just leave areas far more, started to cut back some bramble, started to do my own little bits and pieces of what I thought was the right thing. And then what I did, which I'd really advise, if you like, as you say, if you have friends or people have sort of 2 acres up to say 20 acres, what you want is people coming in who are kind of ecologists, naturalists. So I got in a really good friend of mine, Chris Gibson, who worked for Natural England for 30 years, is an absolute legend within my region. And I walked around with Chris and I said, yeah, so Chris, look, what I'm doing here is I'm rewilding my field. And he said, oh yeah, that is great. And I was sort of mansplaining rewilding to an ecologist. And he said, James, this is great. I love what you're doing. I love what you're doing. It is not rewilding. For rewilding to take place, you need minimum 1,000 acres, ideally more, this kind of thing. He said, what you're doing is renaturing. And that sort of opening up this terminology to allow someone like me with 2 acres. But one of the things I immediately started to consider was, what if I'd lived in London? So rewilding would be something that was impossible for me. What about renaturing? Can you renature if you're in an urban space? Of course you can. So it opens up this concept, if you like, that all of us as humans, whatever little bit of land we have kind of like oversight in, we can be introducing more biodiversity. We can be connecting with that natural world, even on a balcony, even on a window box level, you can be doing this. And obviously, certainly if you have a small garden, if you have a small suburban garden, you're not sure what you're doing with it. It's quite simple on a lot of levels for what you can do. Leave some nettles, leave some bramble, let the ivy grow up over the fences, stick a small pond in, make sure you've got some hedgehog holes, and suddenly, small scale nature restoration, what I call renaturing, you're starting to create. Then you start speaking to your neighbours. You get them doing it. You start creating these little green corridors within your urban space, and everyone's talking. Suddenly you've got your Merlin app going on a Sunday morning, and everyone's listening and saying, oh, was that a black cap? I think that was a black cap. And you're starting not only to actually physically be involved in this process, but you're starting personally to be intimately involved with the natural world.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. Yeah, it's really about opening up your heart and letting the natural world back in. And then what stems from that is opening up your space, and whatever space that might be, and renaturing it and letting nature back in. I love that term. It's a brilliant term. I'm not really fussy about terms. I'm happy with rewilding or what have you. My young son, Frankie, when he was 9 or 10, volunteered with a local organisation in Barnes in West London to create hedgehog highways along all those terrace gardens. And it was one of the recommendations of the Rewilding London Task Force, which was to encourage gardeners to do more, provide more native vegetation for wildlife, create these hedgehog highways, which are basically just holes in the fence or the wall running along terrace gardens. But as people become more open to nature and their understanding begins to grow, then one realizes quite how much we've lost. I love that quote from Aldo Leopold in a Sand Country Almanac. He said, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. And I wonder if you found that as your understanding has grown, because I have. I used to think, trees planted in rows, that's good enough. That's nature. I didn't know, even though I'd had this deep love of nature from childhood and it had stayed front and center through growing up. As my understanding grew, I began to realize the extent to which we've tamed and banished real nature from our lives everywhere. Do you feel the same?
Yeah, very much. And as I say, so part of the journey of that I went on with the book Renaturing was my own journey in terms of physically changing the landscape of this 2-acre plot as best as I could to increase biodiversity. But as you say, learning and kind of reminding myself and being much more involved in recognizing that loss, if you like. And you quote Leopold, who's largely remembered for the work at Yellowstone National Park, 2.2 million acres, proper scale rewilding, where the reintroduction of the wolves in the mid-90s has created such ecological change for the good. And, that even the ecologists observing were amazed at how quickly it took place. This is what I mean by keeping the term rewilding to the possibility of that scale of rewilding, of nature restoration, because that's what we want. And I think if you can keep that, then that's wonderful. Obviously, if in Yellowstone, if you've got 64 miles by 53 miles or whatever it is, fabulous. In southeast England, that's a little trickier to do. And obviously the notion of rewilding and bringing in carnivores is much harder in a British context where, in England, 50% of the land, as we know, is owned by less than 1% of the people. So how do we go about this? We have to use it in a different way, in a different model. But absolutely, as much as we can, I think when we talk about rewilding projects, the best people are those that are trying as best they can to bring back the beavers, hopefully the aurochs or the equivalent, the boars, etc. And then when you can't, as they do in all the best places, you mimic the animals yourself. And so you're mimicking the action. So as humans, you're doing the replacement practice. And that can be fabulous in terms of, bringing other people in, as we say, like Heel, for example, young wilders was a lot that I spoke to for Renaturing again. So getting mainly people from urban environments that want to be involved in these kind of restoration projects. But how do you go about it? And getting them involved in this. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it's partly a process of pressuring the people who can do more and perhaps aren't doing more, but also individually, how can we all be involved? No Mow May, for example, has been a fabulous movement within the small-scale nature restoration. But also, don't forget that if you want a meadow, you've got to mow it. So you need to mow it once a year, so why not go and buy a scythe rather than buying an electric mower or a petrol mower? Just get yourself a scythe, and then you start, this is the process that I've really enjoyed as well, because largely I started off, using an old hedge trimmer trying to cut through blackthorn. I found out in the end, one, you can't hear any bird song, but two, it's much easier with a bow saw and yourself, and you're close up and you do the work. So now I just haven't used any mechanical equipment in the field.
Yeah, I spend an enormous amount of time outdoors doing this kind of thing, especially in autumn and winter. I've actually got myself a little electric chainsaw, which I use for small oaks. There was a woodland plantation from 15 years ago, which needs thinning out. So we thin out some of these little oaks using a little chainsaw, cut them in pieces and make these big kind of 6-8 foot high wildlife piles. And then walking through it in the summer afterwards, where the light has come into this plantation, wildlife piles are now smothered with bramble and dog rows. It's very, very satisfying and rewarding work, and really, really important to my sense of well-being and my physical health and so on, being outdoors. But there's this idea that the nature movement is somehow misanthropic, that it's about excluding people. And Rory Stewart once said in his podcast with Alistair Campbell that the problem with the likes of Ben Goldsmith and George Monbiot is they want half of Britain to be like Alaska, so full of nature and no people, and the other half to be like Iowa. And I think that's a misrepresentation, because I think that we can make space for nature in the places where we live. I think this is a human movement. It's about opening our own hearts and our own space up to the natural world and weaving nature back through the fabric of our own lives and our own spaces. And I think actually in many cases, restoring nature is the surest and probably the only pathway towards social and economic renewal in some of our more deprived landscapes, for example.
Totally agree. Coming from London, one of the things that I really wanted to get across was, okay, I'd escaped, if you like. I got out to rural North Essex. I had 2 acres. But I thought, well, what if I still lived in West London, where I come from? And so I used the example of the iconic Trellick Tower with its brutalist architecture, 217 flats, all very well designed to be south-facing. What happens if you get each of those occupants to put, say, 5 to 10 window boxes on their balconies, put wildflowers in them? Suddenly you've got the equivalent of 4 acres of wildflower meadow, but in a tower block. We've seen it beautifully in Milan, where they have these 2 absolutely fabulous urban forests, as they're called. These kind of green structures sticking out from the urban concrete. There's so much more we could do with kind of urban renaturing. And obviously in that example of Trellick Tower, as you say, it's community project. It's about coordinating people and getting everyone involved in this as well. And I love that idea, because obviously in urban areas, you've got more, it's all about the people, isn't it? It's all about the people. And then it's like, can those people be helping everyone else to be more nature-based? So London Wildlife Trust, for example, who I'm working with, they're fabulous at this. You know, the wildlife trusts are some, you know, I love the way that wildlife trusts operate on a kind of local scale. I think they're fabulous.
Yeah, when we did the Rewilding London Task Force, we found that there's approximately 650 hectares of flat roofs in London alone. Now, all of those could be rubble roofs, they called them, which is a scattering of rubble and some topsoil, and then a self-sustaining wildflower grass meadow, which is wonderful habitat for butterflies and other invertebrates, so black redstarts. And London's got incredible bird life. And with the rewilding of the parks, you know, if you go to Regent's Park or Hyde Park or pretty much any of London's larger green spaces, you'll find exclosures for scrub and more natural water edges now along the Serpentine and reeds. And the species that are now flooding into London are really beyond the wildest dreams of a kind of 20-year-old me when I first moved into London.
Yeah. No, that's so true. So true.
So I have dear friends and neighbours in London who've just inadvertently come into 3 acres in the Cotswolds.
Nice.
And my neighbour said to me, look, if I let you off the leash, you're going to go on for an hour about what we need to do with this. All I really want to have is a single hole of golf. But my wife and the kids want to do some rewilding. So tell me in 60 seconds what I need to do. And so that was a challenge. I thought, how do I get my hour-long discourse into 60 seconds? So I said, well, get a mole plough in there and break up any field drains beneath the earth, but stop up the ditches or block them up, and then rip out any fencing. You know, it's only 2-3 acres. You don't need any barbed wire or anything like that. Just rip all of that out and then just let go and see what comes. And if it gets overwhelming, then you can get in there with a saw or with a strimmer or what have you. But otherwise, you'll just sit back and enjoy the magic. And he said, what are the main ingredients I'm trying to achieve here? And I said, well, it's exactly the things that we've tried to get rid of in the English landscape. So you need scrub, so fat hedges around the edge and scrub popping up through the grass. You need deadwood, so you could ask some neighbour with some forest or something, or some local wood cutting organisation to come with a lorry and just dump some logs in a pile in the middle of your field, deadwood. And third, water. And it would be wonderful if you could pay someone to come with a digger and dig out a few ponds. And I thought that might be an interesting idea of missing ingredients: scrub, deadwood, water. Obviously, there's a load more. But is that a reasonable starting point? Would you have given a similar answer?
The first thing I would say is get a really good pond digger, local pond digger, get them to come in with like a big 3-ton digger and make yourself as big a pond as you can go for, depending on the landscape is all I mean. And hopefully get it, obviously you want it puddled, you want it using the clay. If it's clay, hopefully it's clay, because that is number one. And then, as you say, the thing I would do is then, without doing anything else, I'd leave it for a year and watch what happens and get a naturalist in to kind of like guide your senses. So to notice that, in fact, that long bit of old bramble that you were looking at in one corner, they might say, actually, we'll cut some of it back, but then just let it regrow. Young bramble is one of the best things that you can be growing in your 2-acre plot. Nettles, bitter nettles, obviously, you know. Biodiversity, that's essentially what your target is, isn't it? And as you say, scrub for the songbirds, etc. You know, so yeah, no, I think you've steered him well.
And as for ponds, I mean, if you're on clay, then they will just naturally hold water. But even if they don't, even if they're ephemeral and they dry out in the summer, I'm told that's good news, because all the little predators will die off when the pond dries out. And that's great news for the newts that come back following spring to breed. I had my sister Jemima around my place here in Somerset, and I showed her some lovely bramble cushions popping up in the middle of my fields. I said, look, I'm so excited. And she said, well done, Ben, you've got bramble. It's
a hard sell, isn't it? It's quite a hard sell, the bramble, yeah.
James, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. We've touched on some quite personal and some very lovely things. A love of nature is completely central to my life, even more so than ever now. And your work in making nature accessible, making renaturing accessible to everyone, I think is truly vital. And I'm really grateful to you for spending this time with me now.
It's been wonderful, Ben, and I'm very proud and privileged to be with you at this time as well. You know, my thoughts to your family especially. But it's been good, as you know, getting as many people as we can to remember our connection with nature, our intimacy with the natural world. That's what it's all about, isn't it?
James Canton is one of the most important voices in this great cultural shift that we're undergoing here in Britain, this great reconnection, falling back in love with nature. I urge you to buy his book Renaturing, and his other books are truly brilliant. And give us a like, a review. It all makes a huge difference. Thank you so much. Next time I'm going to be talking to Daniel Curry, who is a range rider, a speaker, and the founder of GRIPH, G-R-I-P-H, which is an organisation dedicated to helping humans co-thrive with large carnivores in America's Wild West. Specifically, Daniel works with cowboys and ranchers, help them figure out how to live alongside such species as wolves and grizzly bears, wolverines, lynx, and so on. And persecution of these animals is rife in those landscapes. So it's all about building a new culture, and Daniel is at the forefront of that.